Hi, this is Benoy, your host of the Solar Maverick Podcast. Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to highlight two upcoming events. First, I want to invite everyone to our summer solstice fundraiser on Thursday, June 4th in Jersey City, New Jersey, to support Let's Share the Sun. Let's Share the Sun is doing important work expanding access to solar energy and storage and helping communities benefit from clean, reliable, and affordable power. They've been mostly focused in Puerto Rico. I've actually gone on 3 delegations in the past year to Puerto Rico to assist Let's Share the Sun with solar and storage for families that are in need. We're excited to bring together the solar community, clean energy leaders, friends, and the Jersey City, New York City community for a great cause. You could join us by registering at the Luma link in the show notes. I also want to thank our sponsors for supporting this fundraiser. Our sponsors are Soul Harvest, Kinetic Communities, Jordan Energy, Positive Deviancy, Renew Energy, and the Solar Maverick Podcast. We appreciate your support in helping make this fundraiser possible. If you're interested in sponsoring this fundraiser, please email us at info@renewenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. Secondly, I'm excited to share that I'm speaking at the ACOR, the American Council of Renewable Energy Finance Forum in New York City, taking place May 13th and May 14th, 2026. I'll be participating in a panel titled Scaling Behind the Meter Solar and Storage for C&I and Digital Infrastructure. This is one of the most important conversations happening in energy right now. Behind the meter, solar and storage are becoming increasingly important for commercial and industrial customers, especially energy-intensive users like data centers. This panel will focus on evolving financial structures, aggregation strategies, and structured platforms that can help distributed energy assets. We'll have a link as well to this conference in the show notes. I'm looking forward to joining this conversation at the ACOR Finance Forum. Let's get into it. Hi, this is Benoy Thanjan, your host of the Solar Maverick Podcast, and also the founder and CEO of Renew Energy. Renew Energy, we're a solar developer and consulting firm. We've developed more than 100 megawatts of solar projects across the U.S., and we help clients execute clean energy projects with confidence. We act as your owner's rep, overseeing developers, EPCs, and financing partners to de-risk your project and keep it on schedule. We also provide development as a service, supporting origination strategy and execution so you can advance projects without building a large internal team. On the renewable energy credit side, we offer REC brokerage, REC asset management, and custom renewable energy credit research, helping clients understand pricing, policy shifts, and long-term market dynamics. In addition, we provide new market analysis and financial modeling to evaluate opportunities, assess project viability, and support investment decisions. To learn more, reach out at info@reneuenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. We'll also have information on the notes of the podcast as well. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick Podcast. I'm your host, Benoy Thanjan. Today's episode is a special live interview recorded on Tuesday, April 28th, 2026 at the MSSIA Solar and Storage Insight Conference in New Brunswick, New Jersey. MSSIA is the Mid-Atlantic Solar and Storage Industries Association, and my company, Renew Energy, has been a longtime member of their organization. It was great to be part of this year's conference and host another live Solar Maverick Podcast breakfast session. The session was titled Using AI to Accelerate Renewable Energy Development from Permitting to Performance. AI is driving massive electricity demand growth through data centers, compute, and the broader digital economy. But at the same time, AI is becoming one of the best tools we have to solve bottlenecks in renewable energy development, grid operations, and asset performance. For this conversation, I was joined by Anna from enSights.ai, Joel from EcoSuite, and Anuj from Spark AI. Anna discussed how AI can help asset owners and operators bring together performance data, financial data, technical logs, contracts, warranties, and site information to understand where they are losing money and what actions to prioritize. regarding asset performance. Joel talked about distributed energy resources, DER coordination, edge computing, gateways to DER, grid utilization, and how DERs can help address the growing complexity of the grid. And Anuj discussed permitting intelligence, AI agents, local opposition signals, data center development, and how developers can use AI to identify permitting friction before placing capital at risk. Anuj and Joel have been both on the Solar Maverick podcast before, and we'll include links to those episodes in the show notes. What I liked about this conversation is that it was practical. We talked about real use cases of permitting, site selection, asset management, O&M, storage, optimization, data centers, DER integration, and post-COD performance. You'll also hear some audience participation. I asked the room how many people were using AI in their businesses, and about half the room raised their hand. Even more were using AI personally. Also, Anuj asked the audience, what business they are in renewable energy and solar. And then at the last 20 minutes of the session, or 15 minutes, we opened up the session to Q&A. This show is where the industry is today. People are experimenting, but the next stop is really using AI to drive measurable business value. So with that, let's get into this live podcast interview from the MSSIA Solar and Storage Insight Conference on using AI to accelerate renewable energy development from permitting to performance. Let's get into it.
AI can now read every zoning ordinance, every minute, every agenda, all the local news, and it can do that all the time before you do site visits, before you put in the time, before you trace any capital. About 45% of projects right now are stalled. They're not approved, they're not denied. They're just stalled. They're in purgatory. And predicting when you might be in purgatory is probably a good thing to know before you put in that money and time.
Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick Podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoy Thanjan, so let's get into it.
Thank you, Dylan. You're the great introduction, and thank you for helping me organize this amazing panel. If you don't know me, I'm Benoy Thanjan, the host of the Solar Maverick Podcast. We're one of the most popular podcasts in solar. We have 278 episodes come out with weekly content. And I know it's breakfast in the morning, and probably you're still waking up, and we are too. And I'm just excited to have the guests that we have today. I think maybe we'll start with brief introductions. We have the greatest minds in AI and energy. So I'm excited to have them come and speak today. Maybe, Anna, if you could start off as the first sort of introduction.
Absolutely. Vinay, thank you so much for doing this, for putting this on, for having us here. My name's Anuj Saigal. I am the Market Strategy and Business Development Director at enSights. What is enSights? enSights is an AI-powered energy business management platform. We really look at the world as doing everything we can to put together all the data components required and optimize and help you run your business. So what does that actually look like? We put together device-level telemetry, granular logs, and metrics from all of your devices connected on site. We really operate best where you're managing large portfolios of disparate assets. We're pulling together your financial data, pulling together your operational data, like technicians, service calls, putting together your contracts, your warranties, your site information. And based on that granular data, we're able to provide real visibility and help you understand where in your leaky revenue, what outages are costing you the most, and what's really needs to be addressed first and prioritized. Just a quick word about me. My background is technology and data. I was a management consultant, exit consulting a year undergrad, and then I was at grad school and focused on renewable energy and decarbonization. I worked in carbon offset markets in London for a number of years, building systems to help monitor carbon credits, rippling it to the market. And like here back in the States, I've been involved in renewables for 15 years now in part role, Central Business Solutions, working on PD, storage, decharging, as well as IoT device, software, going optimization. And then I went to Solar Edge, and now enSights really brings it all together.
Thank you, Anna. And the next introduction's Anuj. He's the co-founder of Spark AI. He actually flew from LA yesterday and got in at 1 a.m. So thank you, Anuj, for coming. And he was actually just on the Solar Maverick podcast with his co-founder, Julia Wu, and Standard Solar, which is a large IPP, if you're not familiar. Anuj, thank you for coming, and it would be great if you could make a brief introduction.
Cool. Cool to be here with you. Thank you for having me. It was not a high cost to pay to be here. Anuj Saigal my I'm the co-founder of a company called Spark AI. Spark AI is software or permitting software. We work with typically perimeter developers to get permitting intelligence and cut through our jargon. All that we account is that we have pre-read millions of documents multiple times a week in nearly every jurisdiction in America. Once again, all that we've ever done to use AI and is to read through millions of documents multiple times a week in nearly every jurisdiction and zoning ordinances, meeting minutes, agendas, local news. And because we have that data, we can now provide a layer of intelligence to indicate where you might have more friction and improve it. That's it. That's all that we are. We're based in San Francisco. My background was a lot of energy and technology. Was a developer for many years. Title up the for what it pays to the project across the nation.
Great. That was a great introduction. And last but not least, Joel Santisteban from EcoSuite. I love saying his last name, and I'm pronouncing it correctly. And he was actually as well on the podcast recently, back in December. We actually got a lot of great feedback from that interview. If you could, Joel, introduce yourself and EcoSuite.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, pleasure to be here. Thanks, everybody, for making it out for breakfast. Hopefully, we can wake everybody up a little bit. Joel Santisteban. EcoSuite is asset management and edge compute platform designed for distributed energy. So we work with developer IPPs. We work with grid operators to deliver software and hardware solutions like DER gateways. We call them edge compute nodes, really just to help accelerate deployment and accelerate integration into the distribution grid to push forward the energy transition. And so we think about the distribution grid a whole lot. We'll talk about some of the applications and the relevance throughout the panel. My background is engineering and finance, but I've been sort of a laborer in the energy transition, specifically development and operations, and now technology for over a decade.
Great. Thank you, Joel. So how we're actually going to set this up is the panel is going to speak for about 35, 40 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions for 15 to 20 minutes. It's interesting because I know Dylan said in the introduction it was project development, but we're actually also going to talk about asset management and operations and maintenance. There's so many topics that we could talk about that we're really kind of focused on those sort of three niches. And it was interesting because our pre-call, I felt, could have went for 3 or 4 hours, but obviously we, kept it to an hour. But I'm going to change everything up. I'm kind of curious, like, how many of you, if you could raise your hand, use AI in your business currently? Oh, so half or a little more than half. That's actually pretty impressive. And then how many people use AI for their personal use? So that's like 3/4 or 2/3. So that's interesting to get an idea of like the audience and, how comfortable or with AI that they are. How many have heard about Claude and agents? Okay, there's like some where I know going to a little bit to the like interests, like more detail, but I'm just kind of curious how familiar people are with like agents. I know, Anuj obviously mentioned agents, and that's like a game changer, especially with what you're trying to do and not having like humans actually involved in the process and to be able to go through every jurisdiction. Can you talk about that and how your capabilities? I know I'm actually changing the format, but I thought it was really interesting. And I loved how you reiterated that twice. So
you're so much happy with AI. It's sort of like, it really sort of starting off broad and then going specific.
Simplistically, yeah. I mean, the way I described this, we just use AI agents to read a lot of documents and then help you get that permitting layer. I'll keep this initial part short. I mean, we can get a little bit deeper into agents. So the way you can use AI, so AI is really good at unstructured data. I noticed because my first company, which I started and sold in 2024, was dealing with structured data, tabular data. It's actually super hard. So where we line up, promise to get to the agent answer in short order here, promise, is unstructured data is just language. It's human language. You know what large language models are good at? Language. So all those zoning ordinances and all that stuff is really straight down the fairway for AI to initially read. Okay, that's cool. And that was 2024, or the kids say 2000 laser, I don't know, whatever. So that's fine. That's all good. So you can process that data. Now, the way you can use agents, which is really cool, is you can, let's say you have a permitting radius you want to put together, and you would have a human follow an SOE, standard operating procedures, to say, get this information. And if it has this type of information, then file it this way. You can actually use an agent to say, okay, retrieve the world's information. Once again, the million documents of every HJ in America. And if it looks like this, do this. If it looks like something else, do something else. It can actually follow the sort of logic that a human might do to put together something very specific like a permit matrix, but there's so many use cases. That is agentic. That is actually following what a human would do, standard operating procedures, and a decision tree, and reach a conclusion based off of instructions. So that is not only using run-of-the-mill AI, which is let's power through a million documents which no human can read. It's now actually applying logic on this corpus of data. That is one example. I'm sure there's 50 other examples that we'll talk about today, but that is agentic. That is sort of next step in AI. Perhaps that was too amorphous, or we can get to more specific examples as we go on.
That's great. If I could, they're cute. The other really interesting and important function or application is this ability to consolidate millions of unstructured data, also structured data, time series data, your metadata about your site and your systems and your battery BMS information or your inverter information, as well as read your technicians' logs and take a look at the photos that they took when they went on site and did this, and then consolidate that to give visibility and follow a script, or decision tree, if you will, to say, if this, then do that, else do this. But also then it can generate a recommendation. It can actually tell you what's the best course of action here, so that you're not sitting there, it's not going to make the decision for you. There's all of this fear, AI is going to replace us, and, and there's so much doom, gloom speak. It's not going to replace us. It's not going to make the final decision, but it will show you what is the best course of action based on all of these data sets that you've pulled together, and what will happen if you do this versus, A versus B versus C. So it can go a lot further in terms of this is where you should go.
Yeah, definitely. That's great. It's interesting because in our interview, Standard Solar mentioned really the competitive advantage is not AI, but the people who know how to use AI. And that's a huge thing. I don't know if any of you want to talk to that point, because that kind of goes to what you're saying. It's really a tool, right, that people could use.
Yeah, absolutely. I have the privilege and the fun of actually working very closely with our customers. The other hat I wear is technical sales support, onboarding, customer support, success, enablement in every way. So I speak to customers every day, different customers. So we have IPPs, large CNI managers. We have IPPs and owners and operators who have tens and tens of thousands of residential sites under their purview, and 60,000 residential sites, and just the quantity of data is beyond what any human can process and really make smart decisions through, or it would take so much time. I see the customers where their eyes light up, and they're really grateful for what we're able to bring, and that is the ability to give them a distilled view, not only into what's happening and what are my 10 worst underperforming sites this past month, or where, how should I rank where I pay attention to and where I roll trucks to, but really push the information of, here are the sites that you're seeing kind of the silent losses, the underperformance that isn't standing out, but is really costing you, is really draining you, and has a big impact on your losses, financial losses, right? So people really appreciate chatbot, the co-pilot, the different functionalities and applications that just allow them to come in the morning and say, right, this is what I need to pay attention to. These are phone calls I have to make. This is where I need to make sure I dispatch trucks today to minimize bleed.
I might jump in with just some thoughts from this discussion. So, we talked about agents, and now we're talking about kind of how best to put AI to use. You use the word distilled, which I love. I think it's interesting because 90% of the room raised the hand in terms of whether or not you're using AI. One of the things that we kind of confront quite a bit is that everybody's experimenting with AI, exploring the tools that are out there, but often it is kind of this foundational, this organizational foundation that is missing to make that really useful or scalable. So in terms of putting agents or AI to use, we offer what we call the distillery, which is just sort of this concept of it's all a mess. Let's leverage agents in various forms and sub-agents to, similar to what Anuj has described, but more to characterize the asset holistically across, what's important to, let's say, transact, or what's important to operate and maintain, and do that on behalf of the customer as kind of a service. And it's sort of it's just layering this really scalable foundation, then becomes super queryable with all sorts of tools that you might want to use or things you might want to build on top of that. That's where I kind of see the industry is at. It's we're all very excited about AI, but in reality, we're still sort of tightening the foundation to put it to work in what will be really scalable ways in the future. So I think that's actually something we can deliver today across all these various pillars of development and operations that I think is helping organizations take the first step. Let's get organized, right?
I mean, that's a great point. I think what's confusing, obviously, there's so much information about AI, and it's where do you start? How can an energy company or developer operator, what is the one thing they should be using in AI right now that they're probably not? I know we saw around 50% of the people said that they're using AI for their business, but is it just Microsoft Copilot or talking to ChatGPT and having a conversation, which is very low level kind of use of AI with the potential that's out there? I know you kind of mentioned that. Does anyone have any suggestions other than obviously using your applications?
I don't want to start. I'm happy to defer, but I think everybody on this panel will probably approach this from slightly different angles in a real good way.
For sure.
I'm happy to start. Where we find AI great, quick, and obvious value is when you've got large data set, disparate data set, unstructured data, structured data, and the photographs, all of these different things that you can feed into models. And it really cuts down, minimizes the latency between an event happening and the decision being made, right? So you don't have to go through the data manually. And because we layer not just performance data, but also your financials, so your plans, your budgets, your warranty commitments, your performance guarantees, and then your actual PPA rate per kWh that you earned at each site, and your OPEX and what you're on the hook to pay, we're able to very quickly show you, based on what happened, here's the implications, here's where you're going to lose the most money. So this is where you should prioritize making a decision, taking an action, and this is likely what will yield the minimal losses, right? It's kind of closing that gap between event and decision, right? Which typically is you have to collect the data, you have to analyze the data, you have to look at different external factors. We're also bringing in irradiance information. We're deriving a weather-adjusted expected performance, and we're showing you not just what's the delta between what happened and what you thought was going to happen, and therefore your loss gap, but actually what's the delta between, based on the sunshine and the irradiance and the tilt and azimuth of the array, what's actually happening and where are you really suffering. And so that's one thing. And then as I mentioned, the attribution of why are you losing dollars and where.
So just kind of dovetailing off of that a bit in terms of all the ways you can look at data and ways you can extract very useful information from that. So the question was how should everybody be trying to use AI? I think our industry is an industry of builders, and historically, and still we deal a lot with C&I scale assets and portfolio managers. And these are often folks that they're comfortable in trying to build tools internally. There's always like this build versus buy dynamic. We're all software people. Like we understand the build versus buy dynamic when you're talking to a customer who might have a tool that works. 90% of the room is using AI. I think one of the things I'm really interested in helping customers do is to build faster, right? We recently introduced this concept called the playground, which is just like an interface to use all that structured data that we helped you organize to go build to your heart's content. You might want a dashboard that looks like this and brings in this. As long as there's sort of that queryable layer, you can really build tools in whatever way that best suits your organization. So I think that's a really compelling use case for AI. It's like, obviously get the data tight and then use that data with your own organizational processes to build applications or reports or dashboards iteratively, really, really fast, right? So I'll pause there. That's one. I think we're talking a lot about generative AI. We, in delivering hardware solutions, which we call edge compute nodes, I mentioned, the industry would most likely refer to it as a data acquisition system, right? Like the box that lives alongside the asset. That thing is so much more useful than it gets credit for. Like right now, it just acquires data generally. Of course, there are more intricate applications, but we believe in sort of unlocking the compute that lives in that box. And there's a lot of machine learning, very real value to be derived from machine learning today. In terms of how operators can be using AI, at least machine learning as a subset of AI, predictive anomaly detection, this stuff is real. We're doing this for customers. And a lot of that is done locally at the edge. So that's another application I think is exciting.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's both of you are mentioning speed, right? To make educated decisions that before would take a long time. And obviously everyone knows like speed's a huge competitive advantage. Now you need less resources, right? Using, great software platforms that you have. Anuj, do you have?
Things Benoy, before I go get a poll of like who does what, like
That was
your developers, how many are on O&M, that will be kind of fun. And then I might switch it up.
Yeah, definitely.
There you go. Let's make it slay people interact.
Yeah, if people could raise their hand if they're a developer.
Developers, okay.
There we go.
All right. IPP, EPC, legal services.
There he is. That's for you. That's for you,
Thank you to our
Steve.
sponsor. Drone. We have drone rafting.
Drone, yes.
O&M.
Utilities.
Oh, O&M. Sorry, O&M.
O&M, yeah.
O&M providers in the room. Oh, great. Is there
Anything we missed?
storage? Vote solar.
So the reason why that's interesting for me is I think
Hiring for staffing groups. Sorry.
Finance,
Yeah.
yes.
So the reason why that's interesting is I think each of these esteemed panelists, my fellow panelists, like kind of approach this problem from a different angle. So, I'm going to speak to the IPP, the developers who raise their hand. And my answer kind of on this is to that, because the original question was, where should you absolutely be applying AI? There's not going to surprise what I'm about to say, but it's local opposition. If you're not using AI to get a bite check on local opposition to predict your permitting friction just for the local community, that's probably not good, to say it nicely. When we did a prep call for us, we had a show prep call last week. We said, hey, we want to perhaps use this panel to push the boundaries a little bit. So I'm going to begin. I'm going to commence. I think right now AI is like, hey, you probably use it, or you might want to think about where it applies in the organization. I think in a couple of years, and once again, I'm speaking very narrowly, is AI is this big thing. It's like new, it's like electricity. It came out. Now, AI is not some big monolith. You got to think about where in your ore, what it's going to be used for. That's all going to be a phased approach. It's not going to happen at once. So these AI task forces that existed, companies, I never actually understood what they're about. They don't make a kind of sense to me. I want to solve X, so I'm going to use AI to get to a better outcome. So back to the question at hand, it's if you're not using AI to get a vibe check on local opposition and you're dealing in more than 5 or 10 EHJs, I think in a year or two that will be professional negligence. Like I really do. Like it will be tantamount to just not using the tools at your disposal to do what's right for the org, for the company. So I think that what I'll say is AI can now read every zoning ordinance, every minute, every agenda, all the local news, and it can do that all the time before you do cycles, before you put in the time, before you trace any capital. And
that layer of intelligence just a few years ago, like when I used to develop projects, didn't exist. So is it really good at making the hard judgment call and placing capital in billions of dollars? No, I would not argue that one still ever overstepping, but gathering intel so that you can figure out where you should spend time from a development perspective and ultimately IDK own projects is absolutely important. I want to cite one figure and I'll toss it back to you.
Sure.
And there's a trend here. About 45% of projects right now are stalled, just stalled. They're not approved, they're not denied. They're just stalled. They're in purgatory. And predicting when you might be in purgatory is probably a good thing to know before you put in that money and time.
No, that's huge. I mean, as a developer, like we've developed a lot of community solar in New York, and it was like we're developing the project. Suddenly the town puts a moratorium.
There are, what's the stat that I wanted to, as you might imagine, I did summer data gathering in Warsaw. I think it was, where moratoria mentions went up 50x since 2020. So Signal mentions a more, not moratoria itself, of which they went from 55 to 500. It's from 2019 to 2025, so a big growth. But now the signals, obviously data centers are contributors. If you haven't gotten there, we can. But the word moratoria, the seal moratoria, collectively across, in aggregate across the United States of America, multiple thousand jurisdictions, is up 50x. I'm a preacher required.
Yeah. No, but I think that's a huge point. Like, I don't think the stats are out there. And I think in the Spark notes, you should actually put that. They have a monthly newsletter, which you should sign up for Spark Notes. They have some great information data. One of the interesting things that surprised me is data centers developments now getting moratoriums. So actually, it's interesting. A lot of the data centers planned for the next year or two are not happening because of moratoriums. And actually, it's interesting because Spark actually does also data center development. Can you talk about like how did you get into doing like solar development to like data center? What's like some of the similarities or differences?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll come to that. So just because we're talking about moratoria and mentions, the word data center, I've got the stat right here. In 2020 went from across the U.S. in planning records with 200 mentions to 15,000 mentions in 2025. Once again, I'm not saying that they're moratoria. It's just the mention of it and its discussion across these different data sources, meeting minutes, zoning, or all that stuff, went up 50x. So I don't know, it's kind of happening. More to your question, how do we get into data centers? Our customers asked us why. You might imagine that there is a professional skill set associated with developing large infrastructure projects. So we work with a lot of organizations, intersect all the way down to small organizations. And those folks are nowadays powered land, powered shells, and want to know similarly that layer of potential permitting friction where they might site a data center. So the short answer for us, so I get into too long, is existing customers that might be done solar and battery storage are now looking to use those technologies to all put together powered land. Naturally, they're interested in permitting a data center, so the pathway was clear, at least for us, as a natural extension of what we do. Same data corpus, but slightly different reads on the data, or cuts of data.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because from the developer perspective, after the big, beautiful bill was passed, now every solar developer is solar plus storage developer. People are looking, obviously, to diversify their business. It's interesting because landowners have reached out to us to develop data centers, specifically in Texas and Maryland. So it's interesting because I think businesses are diversifying based on federal legislation. There are some solar developers who are doing fossil fuel development now because of the current administration. So it's interesting to see.
It's really interesting to see. Without me having names, but like folks who are only doing solar and storage, but now are compelled for all the reasons that we could talk about gas powered. It was side ridge.
No, that's really interesting.
There's no judgment on my side, just for the record.
Yeah,
stating a fact.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's move in the market.
Yeah. And Joel, we're like seeing an explosion of distributed energy resources, DERs. How is AI actually helping manage that complexity in real time, not just in theory?
It's a good question. It kind of ties through to the data center conversation a little bit, I guess. Or I want to tie a thread through to that because I think maybe the most impactful thing that's stemming from just the AI hype and the very real, load growth is the fact that we now have to deal with the very real load growth as an industry. Again, we think about the distribution grid a whole lot as a place where I think there are many solutions and a whole lot of untapped value. So in other words, like, how can we better leverage resources at the distribution system level to address some of the load growth constraints, which feels like just the second thought maybe for a lot of the larger infrastructure development conversations you're hearing is a lot of transmission and maybe behind the meter type solutions, which are first to mind. So yeah, I mean, but to answer your question, like, how is AI helping to accelerate that? Frankly, I mean, look, there's certainly an orchestration element, right? Forecasting what are generally more intermittent resources more accurately gives us a little bit more of a better picture of what's happening in the distribution system, for sure. One of the things that I was thinking about just bringing to the table with respect to accelerating DER deployment and interconnection, really, which is an obvious bottleneck, actually sits on a foundation which isn't really about AI at all. It's just about leveraging digital permissioning, communication, and control technology, right? Like a DERMS, to use an acronym, in ways that I think a lot of grid operators are not very primed and ready realistically to leverage. We sort of have a vision that any asset that wants to integrate on the distribution system could in theory be interconnected nearly instantaneously if it were required to bring the digital control and security model that the utility should but isn't really yet requiring. And what that might mean is during times of high stress, high congestion, high renewables penetration, the grid operator has the ability to sort of, layer in sort of an operating envelope on a set of DERs or a subset of DERs. But in exchange, we're interconnecting way more rapidly. And I'll offer a stat as well to put this in context. This was distribution grid in Europe with 5% curtailment of solar. They actually increased the hosting capacity of that distribution circuit, of that grid, of that network by 225%. So 5% for 225%. This all boils down to utilization, which is a term that I've been really enjoying using. And yeah, I think, again, not really an AI solution, really just a pretty boring technology. It's really about cybersecurity, IT, up-leveling for grid operators, and also the willingness from a regulatory perspective for developers to sort of play into that model, which is a complete 180 from the status quo of I plug my system in, it does what I want it to do, and maybe I pay absurd amounts of distribution grid upgrades to get permission to do that. And I wait multiple years to get permission to plug my asset in. So I think we're just trying to encourage thinking a little bit differently on how we approach this to accelerate.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great point. And
Yeah,
sorry,
let me
Anna.
just add a couple of these cases that we're seeing AI really add value incredibly quickly and tying it to the data center growth. The power generation required to power data center is tremendous, and solar generally doesn't cut it. So you're not going to see a lot of solar. You see gas, you see generators, things like that. But batteries are a huge factor of that curve smoothing, right? And the EMS, the dispatch, and the battery optimization required to take these larger and larger containers that are being co-located with the data center and to pull in market, grid signals, prices, BMS metrics, and all of the different data that's required to generate these, thousands of minute-by-minute dispatch decisions or the day-ahead plan for optimization of that battery asset. This is where AI, we are an EMS, and we do this. We do this controls. We dispatch batteries. We decide whether the power's pulled from the PV or the grid or whatever it is. And we're seeing that that's a huge use case that we're able to really bring value for a scale.
Yeah, that's huge, obviously, as the grid gets more complex with more DERs. And we were talking about this before. Really, solar assets have been underperforming where they should be, especially, once they're in service based on the projections, the expectation. How can AI help with improving operational performance?
Oh yeah, I mean, this is a huge use case, and I have a set team. So the
Love the stats.
P50, the expected P50 typically planned when projects are being built, financed, the performance of solar assets has been decreasing for various reasons, extreme weather events, hail, lack of visibility, things like that. But it is now at about 94%. The delta between your P50 and your actual generation on average is 94%, which doesn't seem super low, but it's actually, the budget is 97%. So you're losing money. And what people come to us with is, I've got this large disparate portfolio of sites at different places. Some are rooftop, some are ground. And I don't really understand. What I see is, when I see my monthly reports, I see that I've lost all this money, but at that point it's too late. So I don't have visibility into what's happening in real time, or at least kind of from a revenue standpoint where I'm really bleeding money. And it's too late by the time I see it in my monthly reports. So this is where really the bread and butter of what we do is we provide real-time actual views into what's happening, what's the delta between, as I said, actual expected, actual weather adjusted expected, and what is it costing you in real time, right? So that you can very quickly pivot to address the most painful losses where they are. And then because you've got all of that detailed telemetry, voltage, the current, the power that you're reading off of your strings, off your inverters, off your DAS, right? Whatever you have on site, off of your irradiance sensors, off of your, maybe weather data that you're pulling from an external service, you've got a broad picture of why. And so you can very quickly dispatch, decide what to do, dispatch boots to the ground, fix those, outages or whatever it is, and really help to stem the bleeding.
That's huge, because I know a lot of IPPs, and we have IPPs here in the room, are always surprised.
Assets against a P50, with some respect, is not super surprising. I think one of the things I joke about a little bit, I think we talked about
this on the
which is just the feedback loop that maybe it was intentionally neglected a little bit, is like, in a world where assets are incentivized with an ITC incentive, the idea is to juice up the CapEx and assume that thing will produce more than it probably will realistically produce, because that gets me a bigger check from the tax equity guys or the lender.
Yeah.
And it just sort of it tosses the performance problem over the fence to the asset management people who are left holding the bag and, getting yelled at for underperformance that they could never meet in the first place. So yeah, I think that's a feedback loop that we certainly want to encourage across the ecosystem, is all right, if we're connecting the dots between the asset, asset management starts before the asset is operating, is something I'll say. It's we're dealing with development assets. We're thinking about, we're modeling them. We're dealing with permitting. We have lots of sort of checklists we fill out before we actually get this thing powered on. We should be connecting both sides of that fence and creating that feedback loop so that we can maybe set more reasonable performance expectations. And it's interesting because, again, that's not even an AI thing. It's just connecting the dots across an ecosystem thing, but certainly is accelerated with being able to slice and dice data faster. Yeah.
Totally. If I could just add one other point to that, absolutely. The feedback loop is huge. And the learning, so the machine learning aspect of AI is really key, because what we're able to do now is help our customers forecast, right? This is what we've seen. These are the outages. These are the trends that we see. And now help me understand how to create preventive maintenance plans so that I can get to those sites every 6 months, clean them, get rid of, the shading or whatever problem, and ensure that I'm not losing X amount of money in the next 6 months like I did this prior 6 months. And you could see for every site what happened, where the problems are, and enable that to kind of help you manage forward and prevent those losses.
Yeah, definitely. That's huge. And just a quick point too, Joel, we know the grid of the future is going to be different, and how you compensate utilities, right? We were talking about this at breakfast. Can you talk about that in Virginia, about the utilization of the grid?
Yeah.
The metric. I think that's huge.
For sure. I'll just talk about it from a high level. But again, it comes back to this term that I used before called utilization, which is, I think, somewhat of it's kind of a common sense metrics that's getting a little bit more limelight when we're confronted with load growth and our options are like build a whole bunch more infrastructure, which certainly is something we need to do to a degree, not like suggesting otherwise. But our other alternative is to like kind of use what we've got better.
Yeah.
There's a whole lot of poles and wires. I mean, a rough stat, don't quote me on this, but I actually think this isn't really measured at all, but a rough stat is that utilization of the distribution grid is somewhere on the order of like 40%. It's going to vary by jurisdiction. But that basically means like we've got room in the poles and wires at certain points in the day that we're just like not using. That's the lowest hanging fruit capacity in front of us to meet the load growth and the cheapest. It's a orchestration, digital infrastructure challenge, and there's some regulatory challenges there. But basically, Virginia introduced just this idea that, hey, we need to start measuring this. Very simple as that. And I mean, this was as recent as like a month ago. This bill was approved to basically say, hey, grid operators, we need to figure out how to measure utilization because, you know, who knows, maybe the future, we've had renewable portfolio standards for various markets and across the US. I think there's this concept of maybe we should be thinking about utilization standards as like a way to drive incentives, right? If I as a utility can prove that I increase utilization from 30% to 40%, well, that should be, you know, you should get a pat on the back for that. And I think with that will come some innovation that's, again, latent right now, or some value that's latent right now in the distribution grid.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate you explaining that because I think once one state does it, then obviously, you know, here in New Jersey, it would be great instead of, you know, instead of the utilities basically getting a certain percent of return on assets, you know, doing other ways for the grid of the future. So we have actually about 13 minutes. And it's funny because we have a lot of other questions, but I wanted to obviously hear the audience, and we have a mic right in the middle. If anyone has any questions, if you could come up, there's a mic right here with our esteemed panelists. The geniuses of energy and AI here. If you could introduce yourself and say,
Hi, so I'm David. I've worked on AI models for the past really lot.
My main question essentially, all you guys are working on the document parsing layer and building on top of that, like variable, where is this down to like how typical insights, but now it's started to take real action. And so my question is, why do you guys all decide where you are? And what's how you guys are expanding for your next frontier?
Sorry, quick follow. Next frontier meaning like an extension of our business, a market. What do you mean by?
Yeah. So what's stopping you from like existing in a slightly different market next door, or like what actually is that's unusual?
I'll offer might be one way to answer that, to tackle that question, because it's a good one. EcoSuite, inspiration for the name, suite of tools for the ecosystem. The reason I mention that is because, part of what we deliver is some of the kind of document parsing and data normalization services that helps them build applications on top and leverage AI and do smart things. We've been very intentional about doing that and using those sorts of tools and providing those services for the entire ecosystem. And there's a lot of players, like everybody raised their hands in the room, right? It's the financiers, the developers, the asset managers, the O&M folks, the grid. There's also data scientists that, you know, could be leveraging these tools or have more open access, easier access to these tools. One of the reasons maybe as business that becomes challenging is because all of those different archetypes, those personas, those stakeholders in the ecosystem, think about the world differently and they have different problems in any given day. So branching out too fast, it's like there's a business decision to that, right? Like we need to provide some specific solutions to specific people that we can deliver value today before we can go and sort of boil the ocean. So that's when I heard you ask that question, I think, you know, we're certainly thinking about the ecosystem and bringing sort of additional value to each of those archetypes as the market pulls for it. Right? But you can only go so fast, right?
I'll chime in. Thank you. That's a really interesting thing to consider. So what we're seeing in the market and, you know, speaking to the huge load growth and the spike in energy prices and the pushback against building of data centers, all the things we talked about, the moratoriums and the political, you know, fear that people have of the rising energy prices and how is this going to impact me? We're really looking at the world in two spheres, if you will. There is the need for proliferation of new DERs, right? Like what you are doing, really streamlining the interconnection process, enabling that to happen quickly. And that's hugely important. I think it's critical right now to provide power to the grid and be able to do that quicker and be able to onboard massive portfolios of assets quicker. So we're POSIGEN went out of business. Number of our clients bought up their portfolios and is buying into portfolios now. And we're talking about thousands and thousands of residential sites that they have to gain visibility into as quickly as possible. So one of the things that we're building is an onboarding wizard so that the process, the timeline between acquiring a portfolio and having full visibility into the telemetry, the contracts, the obligations, the performance guarantees, whatever it is just collapsed, right? So that's like we're looking at what do people need and how can we best bring value. On the assets that are already in the ground, it's all about how do we squeeze the maximum juice out of what they're producing? How do we minimize outages? How do we minimize underperformance? How do we detect underperformance even when it's not obvious, right? Because everything looks fine on paper, but actually there's this steady decline. So it's really kind of using the LLMs with interacting with people and when they're asking questions to bring them value, using ML, using different features within AI engines to bring value to kind of both of those core needs, if you will.
The focus, I think, is the answer. When you start a company, you can do a million different things. One quick pathway to failure in a failure mode is to do everything at once. So when you start a company, we're a couple of years series, so you have a safe company, and I learned sometimes the hard way that when you start a company, you're a founder, you need to simultaneously have a vision for the future where you did many things. Meanwhile, starting like a narrower set of things, and I think Joel said the word persona and archetype, and I think that's spot on. We, just as an example, have huge empathy and focus on the developer experience. We'll start there, and then we have a vision for the future that's different.
All heights, work abilities. Mr. County, regulators.
Yeah, come on.
Sorry, you guys are the most important. I'm waiting for you to speak later today. I played Benoy.
We actually had a whole portion about regulators that we didn't get to, actually.
Like engineered a question here, that how right now, my sense is that the AI processes are, first of all, reactive largely in that they mostly pull data, file it, make it usable or access me, and then just hey, and it's also eventually still it's expensive. You would pay a service expensive. Legislative large projects optimizing. Sorry. The other edge is EnSights a highly in the role where AI units are added into any device it's like, and they're designed self-assemble into an IRB worldwide reach. So Joel's dying says. Such a we talk about this tradition there. When do we get to the world where the power shifts to the self-assembly as a cluster of old devices that present themselves, cells, and present themselves?
That's an awesome question. I wish I knew the specific answer to that question when, but I think
It's that trend.
sure.
Sort of heading that way.
Right. I think the answer is yes. We're in the room now. I think the when it'll correlate with when there's a higher level of like trust from a grid operator's perspective that those types of things will actually work.
Well, that could be band-aid.
Yeah, as well. I mean, look, and I think the technology exists to like bring that level of orchestration today. I mean, again, I think maybe one term I'll use that might be more of like the utility speak is this concept of a DER gateway. This thing that should sit alongside, it's kind of like what the brain of that like set of DERs that might be behind the meter, might be in front of the meter. The DER gateway is the interface for the grid operator. And in that gateway can live there's a security model in that gateway that's really important for the grid to trust it from a cyber perspective. There's in that gateway can live all the AI, right? Machine learning applications that live and operate and orchestrate in its little local ecosystem of DERs.
But the devices that
Right. So there is a bit of like an OEM requirement there, but fortunately, these types of most of the ways that these things might communicate today are suitable, right? Solar inverters as an example, like all of them talk Modbus. That doesn't mean the utilities are happy with that, right? The utilities, they might want DMP3 or what, right? This is getting a little bit more. So just to maybe offer a specific example as context, we're working with Pepco in Washington, D.C. right now to basically demonstrate that these types of gateways can unlock what you're describing. And it is only after actually demonstrating this in practice that I think the operator will have a level of trust that can get us a step closer to like that vision that you're speaking to. So I think it's about trust and one step at a time.
Seeing nobody before you had another question.
Yeah, perfect timing.
And characterize pre-active. That's bullish. You get sense like turning into a much more like unassisted self-assemble. That's proactive. The other dimension is kind of deterministic versus probabilistic. Like, are these AI tools running huge kernel simulations to come up with the most probable thing, or are they just deterministically pulling in everything it says? That's your decision maybe from a like a finance crush. Because I know one finance different take month to grow you a probabilistic by scenarios. So imagine that.
I can speak to this. This is a huge question, right? I mean, AI is only as good as the data beneath it and how the extent to which you trust the data and the extent to which if you run 3 queries, you'll get the same 3 answers every time, right? And in this way, this is something that we're hugely focused on in terms of the data validation of all of the signals that initially come in, and then the configuration of these models to be deterministic. So there's a setting called temperature, and that setting really dictates to the model how wide or narrow you want the result set to be. So when the temperature is set to 0, it is quite deterministic. So it is boxed, right? There are guardrails, and every time you generate a query, the response is consistent. So that data becomes auditable. It becomes something you can use if you have an insurance claim, for example. This has been out, and you can rely on the data, and you can go and see the granular data points beneath those outcomes to be able to produce that in document and get paid. Whereas if the temperature is, let's say, 1, it's very wide. So it queries much wider, and the result set is much more probabilistic. And I think it's important, and this is something we're super aware of, that the data is boxed, guardrailed, and predictable and auditable.
That was a really great response.
Yeah, that was a great response. Great questions. Thank you. And thank you to our panelists. This is the first session that we've done with AI, and I have a feeling we'll be doing it for years to come. And thanks again for coming and making the time. And we're on to our next session, the 9 o'clock something.
Thank you, boy.
That's finished. That was fun.
Thanks for listening to the Solar Maverick Podcast. The Solar Maverick Podcast is brought to you by Renew Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm. If you believe that this podcast is adding value to you, please give us a 5-star review and share with those that you think could benefit from this information. Please email all questions, suggestions, and feedback to info@renewenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. The Solar Maverick Podcast is produced by Podcast Laundry and executive produced by Benoy Thanjan and Kevin Y. Brown.